Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today in the last webinar in our Black History Month series. Today, we will be discussing milestones in the civil rights movement. Before we start, I just want to let you know that if you have questions, you can put those in the chat and we will ask our speaker to answer them at the end. And then also at the end, we will have an attendance link so that you can get credit for being here today. Our speaker today is Professor Joan Johnson. Ms. Johnson has been an assistant professor of government on the Connect campus this year, and she's been at TCC for 15 years. Her work focuses on civic engagement and civil liberties. She has worked on district-wide initiatives, including articulation agreements with HBCUs, Ask Every Student, the All-In Challenge, and Voter-Friendly Campus. So we're very excited to have her with us today. Professor Johnson, I'm going to hand this off to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mertens. All right. First of all, thank you so much for being here today. So what we're going to talk about are some anniversaries, 55-year anniversaries. So 55 years ago, we witnessed two major milestones in civil rights. The first involved a family from Virginia, Mildred Jeter and Richard Loving. The second involved a lawyer named Thurgood Marshall. And I know to a lot of you, 55 years seems like a long, long time ago. But when you think about it, it's really, really not. We've got people walking around today that dealt with the discrimination described in the Loving case and the discrimination in the cases that Thurgood Marshall handled as a lawyer and some that he handled on the court. And then, many people were alive when Thurgood Marshall was put on the court and served on the court because he was on the court until 1991. In addition, the lives of people to this day have been positively impacted by that case and by the actions of Thurgood Marshall. So let's talk about the Loving versus Virginia case first. So here's just the timeline of what we're looking at when we're looking at the case of Loving versus Virginia. It really begins in 1924 when you think about it, because that's when Virginia passed this horrifying Racial Integrity Act. In 58, the Lovings were charged and found guilty of violating that statute. In 1964, their case is filed, and it takes a while for cases to work their way through the federal court system. And so the case is not heard by the Supreme Court until 1967. So that's what we're going to look at in these next slides. So when we look at this horrifying racist law, this Racial Integrity Act of 1924, it required that people be identified on their birth certificates as either white or non-white. They used another word that I'm not going to use, so we're going to go with non-white. They also employed this horrifying, everything was horrifying about this, but one-drop rule where they said if there was even the slightest bit of ancestry that was non-white, you would list yourself as non-white. And then, of course, it went further to state that whites and non-whites could not date, nor could they get married. Now, it's not just Virginia that has this law. In fact, much of the United States had similar laws. So when we're looking at this map, the white states, they didn't have the laws, but you can see the majority of the states did. Now, the dark blue states listed on the map had such laws, but they repealed them in the 1940s. The medium blue states, they had such laws, but they repealed them in the 50s. The light blue states had such laws, but they repealed them in the 1960s. And then when we're looking at the time of the case of Loving versus Virginia in 67, it's the gray states that had those kind of laws on the books. And you'll notice it's pretty much the South. And you'll also be aware that Texas was included in that list. So let's look at the case. So here's the Lovings, and they have three beautiful children. So it's Mildred Jeter and Richard Loving. Well, they met in high school and fell in love, and they lived in Virginia. And so that law that we just talked about disallowed them from marrying simply based on the color of their skin. So what they did was, if you'll notice on that map that we showed previously, they went to DC to get married because it was allowed there. And once married, they returned to Virginia. Now, what they were hoping was what we've got in Article 4 of our U.S. Constitution. We've got a very important clause called the Full Faith and Credit Clause. So, like, for example, if my husband and I got married in Texas, if we moved to Maryland, would we still be married? Yes, Maryland would give full faith and credit to our marriage. So that was the idea behind, well, if we go somewhere where marriage is allowed and we move back to where we are, we should be okay. But unfortunately, that was not the case, because shortly thereafter, the police raided their home in early morning hours in the dark and found them together in their bedroom. And so Mildred quickly pointed out their marriage license, hoping that would, protect them. But they were arrested, and get this, it was a felony, y'all. They were charged with a felony for violating that Racial Integrity Act. And they faced 1 to 5 years in prison just for loving each other and getting married. So that was in 1958 when they were charged and arrested. In 1959, they pled guilty to cohabitating as a man and wife against the peace and dignity of the Commonwealth. That's what they pled guilty to. And as a result of that, they received a 1-year prison sentence. But get this is even, all of it's just horrifying. The judge told them they could avoid imprisonment if they moved out of Virginia and agreed not to return for 25 years. So they decided to do that to avoid imprisonment, and they decided to move to DC where they could be together. And here we've got a bunch of pictures of them together. Just a lovely couple. So ultimately, while they were living in DC together, they became very frustrated because they both had their families back in Virginia and they couldn't go and visit them. So that's when they decided to sue the state of Virginia in 1964. And so when they sued the state of Virginia, of course, the Virginia State Supreme Court sides with Virginia and says that the law was perfectly fine. That's when they appealed the case to the United States Supreme Court. Now, to have your case heard, so this is in 1967, again, not all that long ago, but to have the Supreme Court hear your case has to have a constitutional question. And the constitutional question in this case was, did Virginia's interracial law violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment? And one of the things that we're going to find as we go through this and as we go through the story of Thurgood Marshall, 14th Amendment is oh so important in that Equal Protection Clause. We're going to see it's used time and time again to remedy many of the wrongs that we have had in this country. So basically, when they say, have you violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, they're asking, are you treating people unequally? So the court looked at it and they unanimously decided yes. Yes, they had been treated unequally and the Equal Protection Clause had been violated. The court's decision was unanimous, y'all. And that is something that doesn't happen very often, just so you know. So Earl Warren was Chief Justice at the time, and he wrote the opinion for the case. And in it, he wrote, distinctions drawn according to race were generally odious to a free people and were subject to the most rigid scrutiny under the Equal Protection Clause. The Virginia law had no legitimate purpose other than invidious racial discrimination. He went further to state, under our Constitution, the freedom to marry or not marry a person of another race resides with the individual and cannot be infringed by the state. So another thing to be mindful of when we talk about the U.S. Supreme Court is that its jurisdiction is the entire United States. So not only did this decision affect Virginia and strike down its law, it also, all those gray states that we saw on the map, it got rid of their laws as well. So this affected so many people in such a positive manner. And such actions, again, thanks to the Supreme Court, were banned across these United States. So, of course, it impacted the Lovings, but it also had a huge impact on other people as well. At the time of Loving, only 3% of marriages were interracial. Today, 17% of marriages are interracial. That's more than a five-fold increase. So that's a really, really big deal. And if we look at just approval of marriage between specifically Black people and white people, we can see in 58, at the time when they got arrested and charged, only 4% of people in America approved. Today, we're up to 94%. If we take a closer look, we can see that initially whites were in a much less number approving of interracial marriage, whereas non-whites were more so, and it took whites a longer time to get to that number that we see today. And if we look at regions, you'll notice, of course, the South was much lagging much way behind other areas of the country, with only 33% in 1991. That's 1991, not 1958. But to today, we get up to 93%. So it is that's really recent when you think about that. And then if you look at age groups, we also see a difference. Older people were much more reluctant to come around, and they still remain the lowest group, although it's at 91%, whereas younger people are much more accepting, and were more accepting in the past as well. But again, these are just numbers from 91 to 2021. We're not going very far back. Now, as we learned last week in Jane Crow, we still have major issues involving racism, and Jim Crow can still be in play today. And so, as recent as 2009, y'all, there was a justice of the peace in Louisiana who refused to perform a marriage ceremony for the people that you see on your screen, Beth Humphrey and her boyfriend Terrence McKay. He refused to marry them and sign their marriage license because it was an interracial marriage. And this was 2009. Again, they filed a lawsuit using the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, just like we saw in the Loving case. What happened in that case is ultimately they got married by somebody else. And that JP resigned. But get this, he told a local news station he had no regrets about the decision. And he said, it's kind of hard to apologize for something you really and truly feel down in your heart you haven't done wrong. And I hope you pick up on the sarcasm in my voice, he also added that he wasn't racist. So we've still got issues today that we just have to remain vigilant. Now, some of the takeaways I think that we can take from the Loving case is that many times I'll hear students say, I'm only one person, what can I do? And I get that feeling, I do. But look at what these two people did. The Loving family. That took enormous courage to take on the racist laws of the day, especially given the context of the time. And they put their family and their relationship under all of that scrutiny and opened themselves up for more hatred. And their actions, look what it's done. We've gone from 3%. I mean, I can't even fathom people from different races not being able to date or get married. It's just so horrifying. And we've gone from 3% of marriages being interracial to now 17%. So those two people did a monumental thing not that long ago that have helped out many today. And I would also point to their perseverance. I mean, my goodness, they get arrested in 1958 and they get sentenced in 59 and they try to go on and live their lives, but they realize how wrong it was. And they lead this charge and this fight, until 1967. So that's a lot of perseverance and conviction. I think that's something that we can all take away from this for our own lives. Okay, let's move on to Thurgood Marshall. So there's a picture of him in his office at the Supreme Court and in his robes. And I got to tell you, Thurgood Marshall is just a remarkable, remarkable human being. And he has left a huge impact on our entire society and has improved the lives of countless people with his actions and his life's work. So let's talk about Thurgood Marshall. Okay, so he was born in 1908, and one of his grandfathers had actually been enslaved, okay? And he does so much, y'all, to change the lives of so many people. It's just mind-boggling. So he goes to school as a child in segregated schools, obviously. When he goes to college, he attends a place called Lincoln University, which was in Pennsylvania. And at the time, it was referred to as the Black Princeton, of course, so it's segregated as well. And during his time at Lincoln University, one of his classmates was the famous poet Langston Hughes. And I don't know if y'all have heard of Langston Hughes, but if you haven't, you should really check him out. He graduates from Lincoln University and he wants to go to law school. So he's living in Maryland and he wants to go to the University of Maryland. And they say no because of the color of his skin. That's their sole basis. And this guy is a genius in K through 12 and in college as well. So he attended Howard Law School, which is one of the historically Black colleges and universities that we have in our country. And this really touched my heart. His mom sold her wedding ring to help pay for his law school education. When he was attending law school, civil rights become a huge interest for Thurgood Marshall. That becomes his focus. And he began attending NAACP meetings regularly. Okay. In 1933, he graduates from Howard Law School at the top of his class. Well, he's such a scholar and he's so brilliant that Harvard offers him a postgraduate scholarship to continue his work. And he actually turns it down because he wants to get to work and to start making a change because he sees what's going on and he does not like it. So shortly thereafter, he starts his own practice in Baltimore. And then shortly after that, he starts working for the NAACP. Now, at first, he's working as a lawyer for the NAACP, but then in 1940, they decided to develop like a separate branch of the NAACP called the Legal Defense and Education Fund. So it's affiliated with NAACP, but it's not the actual organization. It's like a branch of it. And he quickly becomes the face of the NAACP because he's the head lawyer for the Legal Defense and Education Fund. And he took it upon himself to travel through the South, tackling so many cases and so many laws, which again takes an inordinate amount of bravery and courage given the times in which he was living. And he tackled cases of discrimination and prejudice. Now, let's look at these successes that this man had, okay? During his time at the Legal Defense and Education Fund for the NAACP, he argued 32 cases before the Supreme Court and won 29 of them. In fact, Thurgood Marshall argued more cases and won more cases before the Supreme Court than any human being ever has. And I surely hope Maryland rues the day that they turned him away. All of his cases are significant, okay? I mean, I don't want to say that they're not, but we're going to focus in on two. One, the first one we're going to focus in on is the one that he himself identified was his most significant case. And the other one is one that affected so many people and changed so many lives and helps lead to the Civil Rights Act of 64. So let's look at Smith versus Albright first. So this is the case that Thurgood Marshall said was his most significant case, and it was in 1944, and it happened to involve the state of Texas. So at that time in 1944, the Democratic Party actually was in control of Texas. When I say in control, I mean in control. For example, the Texas House was 100% Democrats, okay? So what they did was they said that in order to be involved in the Democratic primary elections, you had to be white. So you had to be, I mean, it couldn't be more offensive. They stated white primaries. So you had to be white to be a candidate, and you had to be a white in order to vote. Okay. Now, what is a primary? Well, it just so happens, y'all, that we're having the primary elections going on right now. Early voting is happening right now, and March 1 is election day. So get out there and vote. Okay. Primaries are where the major parties, Democrats and Republicans, choose their candidates for an upcoming election. So once we get through the primaries, like you've got several people running for the Republican primary for governor in Texas. And once we figure out who wins that, let's just pretend it's Greg Abbott, then he would go on and be on the ballot in the general election in November. It's at the general election where we pick who's gonna be governor, who's gonna be a member of the House, who's gonna win. Okay. But what they did was saying white primaries, if you wanted to vote in the Democratic primary, which was the only political party that had power at that time, you had to be white. Just really offensive and awful. And it was even more awful because it wasn't like you could go to the Republican Party and have any political power. So it's an obviously racist law. And by denying them, again, they denied him political power. So Thurgood Marshall takes it to court. And he again is going to point to that all-important equal protection clause like we saw in Loving versus Virginia and argue that they were treating voters unequally just based on race. And the Supreme Court totally agreed with them. And so this is what rids us of white primaries. And y'all, 44 is not that long ago either. To think that this was on the books is truly horrifying. Now, of all the cases he handled, and they're all significant, why in the world would he say that this is his most significant one? Well, he said, if you can't vote, you've got no power. So again, I'm going to stress to y'all, people, marched and took cases to court and all kinds of things for many of us to be able to vote. So get out there and vote in those primaries and make sure you vote in that general election. Okay. Now, the other case we're going to look at is Brown v. Board. Brown v. Board, really, its origins go all the way back to 1896 in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. In that case, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were added after the Civil War to address the issues of slavery and discrimination that people faced. And that's why they had the Equal Protection Clause. They were hoping that way people in the South would treat people equally under the law. Unfortunately, in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, they take that Equal Protection Clause, meaning hoping to protect people and treat people equally, and turn it into something really awful. And they come up with the separate but equal doctrine, saying, well, the Equal Protection Clause allows for segregation as long as the accommodations are equal. And by accommodations, we mean like schools. You can segregate in schools as long as the schools are equal. And we know that the schools were not equal. But that's on the books from 1896 till 1954. And this is another thing to consider. Whenever you're voting for president, one of their most amazing powers is to put people on the Supreme Court, because they're going to be there for a very long time. And their decisions can have generational impacts, much like Plessy versus Ferguson. But anyway, so we've got the separate but equal doctrine in place. And it's a really alarming case because basically they sanctioned discrimination and segregation and said it was completely lawful and constitutional. So that's what allows for segregation on buses, on restaurants, and on and on and on. Well, like I said, the accommodations weren't equal at all. And so Thurgood Marshall takes on this case, and that first picture, that's him on the steps of the courthouse after he argued it. Again, he brings up the Equal Protection Clause. Like I said, I'm not kidding. That clause is a really important clause. And he said, you know what? This separate but equal thing is not working. The accommodations are not even close to being equal. And the court agreed with him. And segregation in schools, like Thurgood Marshall himself had experienced, must have been such a amazing victory, were struck down. They told schools they had to integrate with all deliberate speed. And I will tell you, 10 years passed and Texas still had not integrated. And they had to send in members of the DOJ to get that done. But hugely significant case that affected so many people and still affects people to this day. So let's look at his road to the Supreme Court. So he's done all this amazing body of work, argued and won more cases for the Supreme Court than anybody ever has. And so in 1961, President John F. Kennedy nominates him to the Second Court of Appeals, which is, those are the courts that fall right underneath the United States Supreme Court. So it goes district courts and then courts of appeals and then Supreme Court when we look at our federal court structure. Okay. And then, unfortunately, we know John F. Kennedy gets assassinated and LBJ takes over. And in 1967, LBJ nominates Thurgood Marshall to the Supreme Court. And Thurgood Marshall serves on that court until 1991. So that's not that long ago either. During his tenure on the court, one of the things that he did was consistently argued and opined against the death penalty. If he was in the majority, like in the case of Furman versus Georgia, that at the time in 72 struck down the death penalty for being unconstitutional, the way it was being applied. He was in the majority opinion on that. And then in cases that upheld death penalty, he would write dissenting opinions. So that was one of the issues that was important to him, was the death penalty. He also staunchly defended affirmative action programs and policies. And his interpretation of the Constitution was that it was a living, breathing document, that it needed to be interpreted in the context of the time in which the case was being argued. He would point to there's certain parts of the Constitution that are written in a vague way to allow, he would argue, for interpretation. For example, if we look at the Ninth Amendment, it says, basically the powers not granted to the people by this Constitution are reserved to the people. Meaning when Madison's writing this Bill of Rights, one of his concerns was, what if I forget one? And if it's not listed, the government will infringe upon it. So that's why he includes the Ninth, which is totally vague. It's, because he knew maybe new rights would pop up in the future. Another area that was written purposefully vague and is called the Elastic Clause is found in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. It's called the Necessary and Proper Clause. And we know in Article 1, it lists the powers of the government, like, declaring war and coining money and collecting taxes. But after all that list of powers, those enumerated powers, we have this clause that says, hey, and the federal government can do whatever is necessary and proper in carrying out those powers. Because Madison knew if we didn't include that and allow for some leeway for the federal government, we could end up having government shut down, because if the government had to add new powers in the future without that elastic clause, you'd have to add a whole new amendment to the Constitution, which is very lengthy and tedious and might not work. So those that believe that the Constitution is living and breathing point to those two areas, saying that the framers knew that new rights would come up and new powers would need to be had. And so we should really interpret it in the context of the times, because things have changed since 1787 when it was written. He was asked personally to sum up his role as a lawyer and a justice, and this is what Marshall said: "I did what I could with what I had." And I mean, when you think, it's just amazing what he accomplished in his lifetime. Just absolutely remarkable. After his retirement, Marshall passed away in 1993 from heart failure. His replacement on the court was going to be just the second and only since African American to serve on the court, and he's still on the court. And his name is Clarence Thomas. Now, he is ideologically the opposite of Thurgood Marshall and is known as one of the most conservative judges on the Supreme Court. When we look at current issues today, we've got a couple of them. We've got a Justice Stephen Breyer that has announced he's going to be retiring from the court. And President Biden made a campaign promise that he would put the first African-American woman on the Supreme Court. So we're waiting to hear who his nominee pick is going to be. We've only had 4 women serve on the court in our more than 200 years. We've had 0 African American women. This one hits really close to home. That Legal Defense and Education Fund of the NAACP just last week filed a discrimination lawsuit against South Lake Carroll ISD. It alleges racial and gender discrimination. Says that there's a hostile environment at all schools. They mention for years CISD officials have known that the hostile environment prevents students of color and LGBTQ students from fully participating in educational programs and school activities. And they also mentioned that South Lake instructors were told to teach both sides of the Holocaust. Both sides. I don't think there are 2 sides to that one. And when we look at takeaways from Thurgood Marshall and his amazing life, I think a big one is courage. I mean, it takes a lot of courage to get out there and do what he did and travel across the South and take on all these horrifying racist policies, and persistence. Told he couldn't attend certain schools throughout his K through 12 and college education, never gave up. He fought all that time and got all those victories, and ultimately was able to help so many people due to that. So that's Thurgood Marshall. And I've got a couple of resources here, and they're all movies. I like movies. I do read books, but I like movies. One is Marshall, which is a Hollywood movie starring Chadwick Boseman, which is obviously about Thurgood Marshall. And it's on Hulu Premium. Other than that, you have to rent it. Loving, which is a film about Loving versus Virginia, a Hollywood movie, is on Netflix. So if you've got Netflix, you can check that out. There is a great documentary about Thurgood Marshall entitled Mr. Civil Rights, Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP, and it's on Amazon Prime right now. And then there's a really good documentary on the Loving case too, called The Loving Story, and it's available on HBO if you've got that. And I've seen all of them, and they're all really good, so I would really recommend them. And that is the end of my presentation. So if any of you guys have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them. Or if you have any comments, or we'd love to hear them.
Can we get forward one more slide?
Yes. I was going to do that at the end. You want me to do it right now?
Yes.
You bet. Before we take questions, we want to remind you that we're having a student video contest. And the thing is, the deadline's tomorrow, but you want to do it because you have a chance to win scholarship money. So what you do is you select a figure or event from Black history that's important to you. And then you make a 3 to 5 minute video explaining the history and context and legacy of your subject. And the link that you're going to use to submit the video is right there. So you can actually win scholarship money, y'all. So even though it's kind of short notice, please go get your videos in. That would be awesome. Oh, and Professor Mertens just put into the chat, you want to fill that form out for attendance to the presentation, so that if you're attending, like for extra credit, that's how we're able to know that happened. So make sure you fill out that form. And it's in the chat. She just put it in there. Do we have any questions or anything? Or comments? Oh, you're very kind. Thank you. If we don't, Professor Mertens, what do you want to do? I guess we'll close this one out, you guys. Oh, we got someone typing. Okay. I really do appreciate you guys attending very much. And I hope you have a really good day. And don't forget to fill out that form, okay? Oh, my email? It's Joan, Joan, Johnson, Johnson, at tccd.edu. Thank you. It's right there in the chat. Yeah, I'd love it if you'd email me. Feel free, any of you guys. I'm so glad you enjoyed it. Thank you. Y'all have a good day.